We're going to kick off today with a keynote. And let me introduce our keynote speaker, who is Nick Mabey, the founder and co-CEO of E3G. E3G stands for Third Generation Environmentalism. And just a little bit on E3G before you jump up on stage, Nick. So, I mean, you're celebrating your 20th anniversary this year. You're working on climate change at the interface of policy, of practice, and finding solutions and coalitions to really drive forward progress and action on climate crisis. You are, and E3G has been one of the partner organizations of Mistra Geopolitics for the last 8 years, so it's great to have you up. Do come and join me on stage. And Nick, you actually gave a keynote 8 years ago at the inception of Mistra Geopolitics. So this is a great way of sort of reflecting back on what you said then and how things have changed and look somewhat into the future, I hope. I mean, I've known you for some time. You are absolutely one of the deepest and most thoughtful commentators and researchers related to climate change. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. Set the scene for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me back after 8 years. And it's an honor to be here. And I just actually want to thank Bjorn Ola for this, all the hard work for you, and how hard it is to get big programs off the ground. I think we should all give Bjorn Ola a round of applause for his work. And it's particularly nice to be able to come back and see what we all got wrong, and I particularly got wrong when I gave a keynote at the beginning of this. And just before I say, just a little bit on E3G, just so we work in 12 countries around the world. We have around 160 people, all trying to bridge between politics and practice in this area, and we rely on research and analysis from organizations that go deep so we can go horizontal and work with practitioners and policymakers who have no time to read anything, especially now there's AI, reading AI, which seems to kind of pollute the information space anymore. So thank you so much for your work. People do read it. We do rely on it. I have written a PhD and never got published, so I know what it feels like. And it is really important. I'm really glad this program got forward. So I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to look a bit back at what we've learned, perhaps in 8 years, and also then look forward of how we deal with this world. And everybody knows me, I'm an incorrigible optimist. My first COP was Kyoto. If you only work in this field for 30 years if you're an optimist. So that's a personality trait. You can play off my analysis if you want, but actually I also do think we have a huge amount of agency and a lot more than I would have expected when I started working in this field. So, and it's down to us to solve it. And I particularly liked Lena's point. I look back to the generation that went from my grandparents started off in the car industry, their parents having been in the horse and cart industry, and now we're in the electric car industry. They did amazing things, that generation, to make the world a better place and go from 2 billion to 8 billion and manage that. Surely we can work out how to do the next stage. And it is, you know, let's take inspiration from them. Perhaps not having computers helped. I don't know, to discuss. So I'm going to just kind of say what I'm going to say, because I always do. So climate change is a maker of geopolitics after years of being a taker, and that's because the clean transition is inevitable and seen to be inevitable, which is more important, even by people who don't like that fact. Chinese phrase, the realignment not seen in a century. People don't like that, but it's true. This is not the same world, and we're going to have to work out how to solve climate change in this world. It's driven by economic fundamentals, by domestic politics, authoritarianism. But for me, it's how countries react to Trump too. That's not the cause, it's the symptom. And we really need to kind of understand, and to do that, we have to find our agency. Thirdly, the problem is, whereas climate action is shaping geopolitics, climate objectives are not in geopolitics. And if we don't change that, the Paris regime will not exist beyond 2030. Bold statement I'll get in trouble for with my comms people. And to do that, we need to work with different people. And China and Europe and the middle powers need to work together in different ways. And we really need to reform how we work with others. And there's, you know, the Swedish inquiry, which Rob's a part of, is part of that process. And there's a new battlefield, which is international financial reform. And I'll dig a little bit into that. It's an area we work in very intensively. It wasn't on our list. and I'll explain why it is on our list now as the place which is the fulcrum around which global cooperation for climate and sustainability, and particularly for resilience, is working. And lastly, again, not on our list so much, geopolitics is what's left over when you've done national politics, and that's even more true now. Weirdly, there's more geopolitics around than ever, but I can tell you less attention paid to it by national leaders because their domestic politics are so turbulent. So how do we keep the public supporting what we need to do is a new part of this, and often not looked at by people who do traditional geopolitics, who assume public things. So that's kind of where we're going to get to. This is what I put up in 2017. And I wanted to make the point about numbers that matter in one country. So that little kind of circle of things there. These were, because climate, sustainability geopolitics is not just about other countries' intent and their capability, traditional geopolitics. It's about how fast we can change to meet ecological realities. So it's about numbers. And geopolitics, apart from military counting, doesn't do numbers very well. So I thought I'd make the point there. And if you look through at some of the numbers we were pointing at, China planning to multiply its EVs by 10 times, well, that happened. Europe had a massive investment gap, but it's closed it. We still have an emissions gap, but we've closed that as well. High-cost oil producers are already adapting to a reality. So an awful lot of the things that came up there have been drivers of change. So foresight, so strategic foresight is possible, an important thing to say. People say it isn't, it is. Interesting thing, what was the dog that didn't bark? Kind of food security, it's going to be part of the conference. I'm really interested to see, because I think, in a way, climate impacts didn't make the impacts on geopolitics. We'll come back to that, but climate action has. But I think, again, you can look forward, you can see these driving trends and see what's going to take it. And just, look at it. Compared to 2017, look at the investment flows. And that's not, clean investment's now double fossil investment. I know that's not like for like. But most of it is driven by economics, not by climate policy. That is what inevitability looks like. We need to triple that, but compared to where we were a few years ago, that's a lot more manageable. Inside that, Europe, and so the last one is where Europe needs to invest. So you look, after the Russian invasion, huge uptick in investment. We're now nearly on the net zero pathway, though I think that's a bit conservative, to be honest. I think the investment numbers are bigger. If you did that for resilience, there'd be a much bigger gap for Europe. But things have changed. We have changed what we're doing to move forward. And no one has changed more than China. China said, in fact, we talked about it at the conference, we're going to bet on the clean technology race. And it did, and these are how much capacity. The red is what China owes and is planning to build going forward. It just reiterates the latest plenum. This is its growth model for the future. It owns like 2 percentage points of its growth over the last couple of years. You don't make that choice if you're not serious about it. So again, these are all about inevitabilities. This is not inevitable. But when the IEA, now considered the left-wing organization by Republican senators in a recent report, says we're going to peak global fossil in 2030s, and if we go near our targets and out policy, the red line will get a much deeper thing. There's another graph I didn't include with all of the oil companies' projections, which will go up. So there's a fight over the future. The IEA used to be with the oil companies. Now it's with Greenpeace and SEI and E3G convincing. So don't underestimate the cataclysmic psychological shock to investment markets when the peak happens. When we start owning the future, because that investment starts changing the future. Again, I was talking to Anders. When I started in this job, there were only people making windmills were Denmark. And the only commercially, and the only solar panels you could buy were on Casio watches. It's a very, very different world. And that shows we have the capability to change things. None of that would happen without climate policy. It was not a kind of gift from God. It was a result of choices. So what have we learned since this point? Well, we've learned that climate action has driven geopolitical reactions. Cost reductions have made things inevitable. And that's, Saudi and UAE and others have new strategies which assume inevitability. They want that inevitability to be as slow as possible to maximize their revenues, but they're not betting against the transition. We have had China Shock 2.0, driven by clean technology, but not by the other parts of Made in China, which were nanotech, biotech. The other bets China made didn't come off. What came off was EVs and clean energy. And we worked with them on that, and Europe worked with them on that. Washington consensus? What Washington consensus? US and European trade policy. I mean, I would have been lynched if I came up with what DG Trade in Brussels. I come up with DG Trade comes out as a trade policy now. We're putting IPR conditions on Chinese investment coming into Europe. I mean, this is like anathema. So huge changes, huge benefits. Even CBAM didn't cause, it was driving change around the world. Not a great fan personally, but actually, it's interestingly, countries were muted to it because they wanted to preserve the WTO, that was China. But also, a whole lot of other things have happened in the same context, particularly in terms of these issues about from COVID and from Russia, Ukraine, or driving up debt, driving up distrust, fragmenting markets, fragmenting approaches. That issue of debt and distrust is the fundamental geopolitical underpinning of everything, and we'll go through some of those points. So what have we learned? This is my personal view. It's complicated. We used to think geopolitics would stop climate action. Sometimes it drives it. So, used to be climate was something you did to avoid talking about tough things, Sunnylands, those kind of things. That's not true anymore. So climate is now a top table issue. The Chinese and the Americans arguing over, is it a climate cannot be a greenhouse in a snowstorm, was my favorite Chinese metaphor, protective from the rest of geopolitics. And we go in and out of that one. But basically, climate touches so many things it can't be taken off the table. It was being very aggressively used by Xi as a bit of a wedge issue. That's coming back. There's a whole set of, I get inundated by cooperation approaches from Chinese organizations we work with all the time. As opposed to the past, the EU is the one who's kind of a bit cool, and Chinese are very forward-looking. A lot of leveraging of West versus China rivalry. Who's going to give me the best offer for clean manufacturing by middle powers. It's the Yugoslavia moment. You can have a lot of leverage if you're prepared to use it. And this whole issue of the feeling that the West was losing Africa and Latin America has meant, and particularly drove, a huge wave of reforms in multilateral development bank system, Bridgetown agenda, etc., which were essentially driven by Barbados and other developing countries, Africa Group, with the support of Macron and Biden and others. Totally different. They had set an agenda, and we drove it through institutions owned by the West, which did not want to change. That's still half going. So actually, geopolitical tensions have driven kind of competitive climate and sustainability action. They've also got in the way, but they also really not addressed the fundamental issue of climate damages, except in a tactical way. So the White House came to me and said, do you know anybody who does adaptation projects in the Pacific? Because we want to do this as a kind of Pacific lead in the NSC. Because they want projects to stop them going to China. So it's like that kind of transactional, we care about because you care about it, but we don't really care about Pacific climate stability. So a lot of that's gone on, but really not how do I secure my interests on this issue? And that's the problem. So it is more complicated than perhaps we thought. The forces work in different ways. But we have benefits, and I'm going to go through this in detail, but just to say, I often get people saying Europe was a sucker for doing climate. Europe has benefited so much from keeping the UNFCCC alive, creating the global renewables market with taxpayer subsidies, maintaining open trade, which I think was the right thing to do on solar with China, and paying the bulk of the money, 80%, because America underpaid. From that investment, we gained hugely in terms of reduced climate damage, in terms of health, in terms of ability to respond to Russia. But that is the past. So if this is my end of my past looking, and I'm looking forward, how should Europe respond to the new context? Because in a way, Europe actually made some pretty good bets. It sometimes doesn't feel the confidence of those bets, but I think it's an area we need to look at. So what's the future look like? I grabbed these from a couple. That's the European Climate Risk Assessment 2024, just to say, purple and red are bad. Basically saying we are not very adapted. There's a bunch of stuff from those hippies at the G20 Financial Stability Board predicting massive GDP losses. So Draghi wrote a report on European productivity to 2050 and failed to mention that if we didn't improve our resilience, all of the productivity losses would be worked out just by climate damage. And we're not improving our resilience because that's what that says. And those are very conservative numbers. So, this is a mainstream thing now. It's not, just research institutes. This is mainstream institutions going, not only are damages getting worse, but our resilience, even in rich countries, is not very good. So that's the backdrop. We've made progress. Again, look at the side. We were at 4.4 degrees when I started in this game, perhaps even 6 degrees we thought was BAU. Paris took us to around 3. Moving to Glasgow, we got to 2.2 to 2.4 if you're looking good. But if we got everybody this year to align with their own net zero targets, so China move its 2030 and 2035 targets to meet net zero by 2060, we'd be at 1.9. They've already announced those targets, different quality. But we're not a million miles off saying what the trajectory is going to be owned by countries. The question is, can we deliver it? And compared to the other things going on at the same time, and look at Baku succeeding when we had plastics and biodiversity not, this shows there's a foundation of interest here that is keeping people in the game. And fundamentally, so I think norms-based cooperation is not going well, but interest-based negotiation, there is still a space to move forward. And I think that's, again, agency. This is an asset we can't afford to lose. And the problem is this is the year, or the next 5 years, is the adjudication moment. Paris was easy. Yay, we got a treaty, everybody's in it. Glasgow's, yeah, net zero is kind of possible. 95% of countries signed up to net zero. That's why we get those good numbers. This year we actually have to show it's delivering for everybody. So if you look at the Brazilian agenda, it's like the money has to move. Show the money moves. If you do the right thing, the money moves to your economy. That is a very different thing to signing a piece of paper. So the geopolitics and cooperation of that is much harder. And we need to persuade G20 countries, and I've put some of the ones up there who need to move, to make some big decisions about changing their economy. That's not, again, and to do that, countries like the EU, especially now with the Americans not being in, will have to make some big issues about trade. So who are we going to encourage to produce green goods? Are we going to buy them? The Chinese aren't going to buy them. The Americans probably won't buy them. So it's not just about aid. It's not just about our work at home. It's about our relationship with those countries. So we require the G20 countries who emit emissions and hurt us to make leader-level decisions about development. So we need to have a strategy that's also at that basis. And I think that's where it comes back to, are we taking this project seriously enough compared to what we're asking other countries to do? And what do the other countries want? So again, what do those countries see in the world? So nice picture, lots of things moving, potential agency. What do they see? The countries. They see 90% of the 2.1 trillion in green investment I just talked about going to the OECD and China. So you feel a bit left out. 70% of Chinese exports go to developing countries. They were running around Baku going, we don't just want to sell you stuff, we want to invest in your country. And they do, partly because Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey have also put tariffs on Chinese EVs. So this is not just a story about US-China. The actual market growth, and where we need the market growth, is not in the 15% of the global energy economy that is America, but the 85% of the global energy economy and growing, which is Southeast Asia and Latin America and Africa. And so that's where we need to there. And China needs that growth to keep itself growing. So we're starting to look at some interests here. China needs to grow. That growth is coming from EMDEs. We need EMDEs to go clean to meet Paris. There starts to be an outline of a bargain there. But the very things that we're trying to work against, political uncertainty, this is from an IMF paper, which was just last year, basically saying economic uncertainty is going up. We have correlations saying with economic uncertainty, investment drops. Don't worry, we'll circulate the PowerPoint later. But basically, and their answer was, don't spend so much money, hoard large amounts of money on your budget, which is a classic doom loop. So in response to more geopolitical uncertainty, and this economic uncertainty doubtless has gone up again, is driven by geopolitics and technology, and I would also say climate impacts. So if the response, and it's a theme here, if the response to fear is defense, then you don't tackle the fundamental sources of fear. And I think that's where the core moving forward, and we can, I won't go through it, but basically, if we do not change the financial system, so you're rewarded for doing good climate policy by getting more access to capital at better rates going forward, and this is the geopolitics of finance, then there will be no climate transition, and there will be no resilience transition. And we need to do that without the US, which is the world's largest private sector financial power, has a certain amount of veto power in the IMF and is the largest shareholder of the World Bank and the International Development Bank, but is not the largest shareholder of the other 85% of the MDB system. So the question is, if you're trying to change the financial system as a fulcrum of climate geopolitics, how do you get past the US? And that's it. So what is our plan in Trump or MAGA 2? Because Trump 1, to be honest, all we said was 4-year Trump, don't worry, aberration. Hold your nose, get on with it. Can't say that now because people assume this is a permanent America. So we know the US has been an unstable climate partner for 30 years. You know, I went through Bush 1 and 2. Europe has kept them maintained through that. Europe can't do that on its own, I'm going to say. You know, we know turbulence is baked in. We know transactionalism is baked in. But the question is, what do we do about it? And you know, our suggestion, and this is about the best case scenarios at the bottom, which is a bit of multipolar multilateralism, some plurilateralism, and some transactionalism, not grand global governance visions, to say, let's keep the clean economy on track. Let's make sure we have clear strategies for responding, or not responding to Trump, working around Trump, build those systems for multilateralism we can, which focus on energy transition, financial reform, clean trade, and resilience, and deepen those bilateral partnerships. So I will go. I'm still on time according to my watch. And so what are those choices? The choices are, for Europe, are you defensive or proactive? And what's your relation with China? And this comes back to core geopolitical plans. And if you read van der Leyen's political guidelines for the new commission, it looks like we're going to be proactive based on strategic partnerships, supporting international law, moving out in the world. If you look at what Europe's doing, it looks very transactional, very defensive. And you need some of that. It's not that you don't need that, but you need... if you look at what Europe can do, it used to be it could drive the global green economy. It can't now, so it has to find new partners. And it also needs to do that in a way aligning with China in a way that is acceptable to the European people, because this is, you think Europeans think differently about China to the Americans? That's the latest surveys. Very, very negative. So mindful of time, I'll switch through. So obviously we need to, this is a bit about China, so we need to find a way of working with China that's kind of working with China but not working with China, and aligning our economic interests, our climate interests, our interest in financial reform, financial regulation, and aligning our climate finance, both of which is broken in both of our countries. Just so China overpromises and overdelivers. That's China's climate aid, 10% of what they promised. So again, it's just a bit of agency. Not everybody else is better than us. So So what we need is a set of new strategies for you, and that's where we go. Don't spend your time watching Trump. Trump cannot change the reality you experience in terms of sustainability or climate change. He can make it harder to change that reality, but the Americans are not killing the earth, and most of America is run by blue states anyway. But what they can do is disrupt the cooperation we need to achieve and make the outcomes we need. And the question is, will the public support that? So that's, if we can manage the geopolitics, can we manage our domestic politics? This is a survey done in the UK. And the word cloud on the left is what people thought of the UK, other countries thought the UK was. Soft touch. Weak. Joke. It's after Brexit, but it's quite a long time after Brexit. And I imagine if you see this as well, what should we be? A leader. And core to this is the idea of reciprocity, getting something back, seeing your money work. So there is a proposition you can put to our publics, even in a time of instability and insecurity, which is about agency in the world. It has to have a geopolitical, it has to be very practical, it has to be very honest, it has to be very reciprocal, which is slightly different to the perhaps we framed it before. But I think inside that, this is a geopolitics we can respond. And going back, this is what I'd write down now if I was doing a 2017, what are the trends we see forward? And the core thing is, not, the response to Trump 2 is the opportunity, just like in some ways a defense, to build real agency in terms of sustainability and climate, taking the lessons from the last 8 years. But that will require us to do things very differently with very different partners and in a way that engages our public a lot more than we've done in the past. But those are all things we can do, not things we're asking other people to do. And I think that, for me, is my message of optimism. I told you, congenital optimist, which I'd love everyone to take out of this conference while we talk about problems for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.